Imagine a world without headlines, without history books, without clear beginnings, only whispers carried by sandstorms, fading inscriptions on stone, and memories passed from one generation to another. This is where the story of Islam truly begins, not with certainty, but with mystery. 1400 years ago, in a land most empires ignored, something emerged that would reshape the course of human civilization. Yet its earliest origins remain one of the most debated and misunderstood subjects in world history. To some, Islam appeared suddenly, fully formed, as if descending into history without preparation. To others, it was the result of deep social, spiritual, and political currents that had been flowing for centuries beneath the surface of Arabia. This documentary does not begin with answers. It begins with questions that historians, believers, and critics still struggle to resolve. What kind of world gave birth to Islam? Why did its message resonate so powerfully, so quickly, and across such vast territories? And why, after 14 centuries, do debates about its origins remain unresolved? To understand the hidden origins of Islam, we must first step into Arabia as it existed before the Quran, before the Prophet Muhammad, before the idea of a unified Islamic civilization even seemed possible. Arabia was not an empty desert frozen in time. It was a crossroads, geographically isolated yet culturally connected, politically fragmented yet economically vital. Trade caravans moved through its sands, linking Byzantium to Persia, Africa to Asia, carrying not only goods but ideas, beliefs, and stories. Mecca itself was more than a town, it was a sanctuary, a religious hub where tribes gathered, not united by nation or law, but by survival, honor, and tradition. The Kaaba stood at its heart, already ancient, already sacred, surrounded by idols representing gods from across Arabia, yet hinting at a much older monotheistic memory that had not fully disappeared. This was a society governed not by centralized power but by tribal loyalty, where justice depended on strength, poetry preserved history, and morality was negotiated through custom rather than law. Yet beneath this apparent stability was tension, economic inequality, blood feuds without end, the neglect of the weak, and a spiritual restlessness that idols could not fully satisfy. Beyond Arabia's borders, the world was in crisis. The Byzantine and Sasanian empires, superpowers of their age, were exhausted after decades of war, their populations burdened by taxes, religious persecution, and political decay. Christianity was divided by theological conflicts. Judaism survived under pressure. Older pagan traditions were fading. Monotheism was no longer new, but it was fractured, contested, and often weaponized by states. Arabia absorbed these tensions like a sponge, yet remained outside imperial control, making it both vulnerable and free. It was here, in this liminal space between empires and ideologies, that Islam would emerge, but not as an accident, and not in a vacuum. The mystery lies not only in what happened, but in how little we truly know about the earliest years. Most written Islamic sources were compiled generations later, shaped by memory, devotion, and politics, while non-Muslim sources are scarce, fragmented, and often hostile. Archaeology offers clues but not full clarity. What we are left with is a puzzle, a movement that transformed tribal societies into a global civilization within decades, driven by a message that claimed continuity with Abrahamic faiths, yet introduced a radically new social order. Was Islam a sudden divine rupture in history, or the culmination of long-forgotten currents waiting for a voice? Did it rise because the world was ready for it, or because it forced the world to change? These questions make the origins of Islam not just a religious story, but one of the greatest historical mysteries ever recorded. In this series, we will not rush to conclusions or offer simplified answers. Instead, we will peel back layers, political, spiritual, cultural, and human, to explore how Islam emerged from obscurity into dominance, why its message challenged existing power structures, and how its beginnings continue to shape global debates today. This is not a story of blind faith or blind criticism. It is an investigation into how ideas are born, how societies transform, and how a message from the desert became one of the most powerful forces in human history. The mystery has survived 14 centuries, not because it lacks evidence, but because it demands understanding beyond emotion, beyond ideology, and beyond inherited narratives. And this is only the beginning. To understand the hidden origins of Islam, we must first widen our lens beyond Arabia and observe the world as it stood in the early 7th century, a world exhausted, divided, and quietly collapsing under its own weight. This was not an age of progress and stability, but one of crisis, where the great civilizations that dominated history were struggling to survive. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, controlled vast territories stretching from the Mediterranean to the Near East. Yet its power was hollowed out by endless wars, crushing taxation, and deep religious fractures that turned theology into a weapon of the state. Christianity, far from unified, was split by fierce doctrinal disputes, Nestorians, Monophysites, Chalcedonians, each accusing the other of heresy, each backed or persecuted by imperial authority. For ordinary people, faith had become less a source of spiritual comfort and more a cause of fear, as belief could determine loyalty, safety, or death. To the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire rivaled Byzantium in power but mirrored its decline, locked in decades of brutal warfare that drained its economy, destabilized its ruling class, and alienated its subjects. Zoroastrianism, once a unifying force, had hardened into a rigid state religion, leaving little room for dissent or reform, while social inequality widened between the elite and the masses. Between these two giants lay a vast region of instability, Levant, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, where smaller communities absorbed the shockwaves of imperial conflict. Trade routes were disrupted, cities changed hands, and populations were displaced, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that reached even the deserts of Arabia. Yet alongside political collapse was a deeper crisis, a crisis of meaning. Across the known world, people were questioning inherited beliefs, searching for moral clarity in a time when institutions had failed them. Judaism persisted through resilience, but often under foreign rule. Christianity struggled with its own contradictions between spiritual ideals and imperial power. Ancient pagan traditions were fading, unable to answer new social realities. Monotheism was no longer revolutionary, but it was fragmented, contested, and entangled with politics. Arabia, though lacking an empire of its own, was not isolated from this turmoil. Merchants, travelers, monks, and refugees carried stories, scriptures, and debates into its markets and meeting places. Arabic poetry, rich and precise, preserved not only tribal history but reflections on fate, honor, and the unseen, revealing a society already engaged in philosophical thought, even if informally. Mecca and other trade centers became listening posts of the world where ideas from Syria, Ethiopia, Persia, and beyond quietly intersected. At the same time, Arabia's lack of centralized authority created a unique social landscape: no emperor to enforce doctrine, no church to silence dissent, no army to impose belief. This absence of rigid power structures meant that new ideas could circulate freely, yet it also meant that injustice went largely unchecked. Women had few protections, the poor were vulnerable, and violence between tribes was normalized. The old systems no longer worked, but no new system had yet emerged. In historical hindsight, this moment appears almost suspended, as if the world was holding its breath. Two exhausted empires faced each other, religions argued over doctrine rather than ethics, and ordinary people lived between fear and hope. It was in this global vacuum, created not by ignorance, but by the failure of existing powers, that Islam would soon appear, offering not merely a theology, but a comprehensive framework for life, law, and community. The rise of Islam cannot be separated from this context. It was shaped by it, and in turn, it reshaped it completely. Understanding the world before Islam is not about diminishing its message, but about recognizing why that message resonated so deeply and spread so rapidly. History shows us that ideas do not emerge randomly. They emerge when the old world can no longer sustain itself. And by the early 7th century, the world was ready, whether it realized it or not, for something radically new. Long before Islam emerged as a unified faith, Arabia was already a land of belief, contradiction, and spiritual memory, far more complex than the label of simple paganism often suggests. While idol worship dominated public religious life, it coexisted with older monotheistic echoes that had never fully disappeared, creating a fragmented yet fertile spiritual landscape. The Kaaba in Mecca, later central to Islam, was already ancient and revered, not merely as a structure housing idols, but as a sanctuary tied to deep ancestral traditions that many tribes associated with Abrahamic origins, even if those origins had become blurred over time. Pilgrimage, sacrifice, and sacred months were observed across Arabia, indicating a shared religious framework that transcended individual tribes. Alongside polytheism existed communities of Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, particularly in regions like Yathrib, Najran, and the northern trade routes, each preserving their scriptures and rituals while influencing local culture. Jewish tribes in Arabia were not outsiders, but integrated participants in trade, agriculture, and intellectual life, carrying with them stories of prophets, law, and covenant that would later echo strongly in Islamic revelation. Christian monks and ascetics, often living on the fringes of society, introduced concepts of monotheism, accountability, and the afterlife, while their presence hinted at a dissatisfaction with the dominant religious order of the empires they had left behind. Yet perhaps the most intriguing group were the Hanifs, individuals who rejected idols without fully embracing Judaism or Christianity, seeking a pure monotheism rooted in the legacy of Abraham. Though small in number, their existence challenges the notion that Arabia was spiritually barren. Instead, it suggests a society already questioning inherited beliefs and searching for truth beyond tradition. Poetry and oral culture further reveal this hidden depth, as verses often reflected on destiny, morality, and the fleeting nature of life, themes that would later become central to Islamic teachings. At the same time, religion in Arabia lacked a moral framework strong enough to restrain social injustice. Worship rituals existed, but ethical responsibility was tribal, not universal, loyalty as owed to kin, not humanity. This created a paradoxical environment, spiritually aware yet morally fragmented, religiously active yet ethically unstable. The poor, the orphaned, and the enslaved were largely unprotected, while wealth and status determined worth. It was within this tension that the groundwork for transformation was laid. Islam did not enter Arabia as a foreign idea imposed from outside. It emerged into an environment already primed with monotheistic concepts, sacred spaces, and spiritual dissatisfaction. What made Islam revolutionary was not merely its insistence on one God, but its redefinition of morality, accountability, and community under that belief. By drawing upon familiar symbols while radically reshaping their meaning, Islam spoke in a language Arabia already understood, yet challenged everything it took for granted. The hidden belief systems of Arabia were not erased by Islam. They were reorganized, purified, and redirected into a coherent worldview that offered both spiritual clarity and social justice. Understanding this layered religious landscape helps explain why Islam's message felt simultaneously familiar and transformative, as if it awakened something long dormant rather than introducing something entirely new. In this sense, the origins of Islam are hidden not because they lack roots, but because those roots were scattered across generations of belief, memory, and quiet descent waiting for a unifying voice. When the Quranic message first emerged in 7th century Arabia, it did not arrive as a philosophical treatise or a political manifesto, but as a voice, recited, remembered, and repeated in a society where oral tradition carried more authority than written text. This alone made it powerful because it entered the bloodstream of Arabian culture rather than standing apart from it. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, known among his people as trustworthy and reflective, retreated often into solitude, disturbed by the moral emptiness and social injustice surrounding him. And it was in this state of reflection that revelation began. Yet from a historical perspective, what matters most is not only the experience itself, but how the message functioned within its context. The Quran did not present itself as a new religion disconnected from the past. Instead, it positioned itself as a continuation, repeatedly invoking earlier prophets, Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus, linking its authority to a shared monotheistic lineage already familiar to many in Arabia. At the same time, it directly challenged prevailing power structures, confronting idol worship not as a harmless tradition, but as a system that justified inequality, moral irresponsibility, and elite control. Its language was uncompromising, rhythmic, and confrontational, condemning exploitation of the poor, abuse of orphans, dishonest trade, and tribal arrogance, while asserting a radical idea for its time that all human beings were equal before a single transcendent God. This moral universality threatened Meccan elites far more than theological disagreement because it undermined the economic and social order built around pilgrimage, status, and inherited privilege. Unlike earlier monotheistic movements that had become tied to imperial authority, the Quranic message began among the marginalized: slaves, women, the poor, and those without tribal protection, transforming belief into a source of dignity and resistance. Historically, this is crucial because it explains why opposition to the message was immediate and severe. Persecution, boycott, and social isolation were not reactions to abstract theology, but to a worldview that demanded accountability beyond tribe and wealth. The Quran's structure itself reflected this struggle. Reveal. Gradually responding to events, questions, and crises, it functioned as a living dialogue between revelation and reality. Rather than offering systematic theology up front, it reshaped consciousness, redefining time, death, success, and failure until belief translated into action. From an outsider's perspective, this gradual emergence complicates attempts to pin down Islam's origins to a single moment or influence, which is why the debate remains alive among historians. Was the Quran shaped by its environment, or did it reshape that environment from within? The answer likely lies in the interaction between the two. The Quran spoke in the language of Arabia but refused to submit to its values. It borrowed familiar narratives but transformed their meaning. It acknowledged existing traditions while exposing their moral limitations. This dynamic allowed the message to spread not through force, but through persuasion, resilience, and a profound reorientation of purpose. By the time migration from Mecca to Yathrib occurred, the Quranic message had already evolved from personal revelation into the foundation of a new community bound, not by blood, but by belief and ethics. In historical terms, this marked a turning point. Islam was no longer merely an idea, it was becoming a system. And it was this transformation, rooted in the Quranic message, that set the stage for everything that would follow. When Islam transitioned from a persecuted belief in Mecca to an organized community in Medina, it entered a new phase that fundamentally altered its historical trajectory, transforming it from a spiritual message into a comprehensive system governing society, law, and power. This shift was not accidental, nor was it purely political. It was the natural outcome of a message that demanded ethical consistency in every aspect of life. Medina was not an empty stage awaiting leadership. It was a city fractured by tribal rivalries, economic disputes, and cycles of violence that existing customs had failed to resolve. Into this volatile environment, Islam introduced a radical framework that redefined loyalty, authority, and justice. The Constitution of Medina, often cited as one of the earliest written social contracts, established a pluralistic order where Muslims, Jews, and other groups were recognized as part of a single political community bound by mutual defense and legal accountability rather than bloodline. This alone marked a profound departure from the tribal norms of Arabia, where kinship determined protection and rights. Socially, Islam challenged entrenched hierarchies by elevating moral conduct over lineage, granting women rights to inheritance and consent unheard of in the region, restricting practices like infanticide, and insisting on care for the poor, the orphaned, and the enslaved as acts of worship rather than charity. These reforms were not symbolic. They reshaped daily life and redistributed moral authority away from elites toward shared ethical responsibility. Politically, leadership under Islam was framed not as divine kingship, but as accountable stewardship, with the Prophet Muhammad acting as judge, mediator, and guide, rather than an untouchable ruler. This model contrasted sharply with the imperial theocracies of Byzantium and Persia, where religion served the state. In Islam, the state was meant to serve moral principles. Economically, the prohibition of exploitative practices and the introduction of obligatory charity created mechanisms to reduce extreme inequality, reinforcing social cohesion. Yet this revolution was not without resistance, both internal and external. Conflicts with Meccan forces, alliances, and betrayals among tribes, and negotiations with neighboring communities tested the resilience of the new system. Importantly, warfare in this period was regulated by emerging ethical rules that sought to limit excess, protect non-combatants, and frame conflict as a last resort rather than a tool of conquest. From a historical lens, this phase is critical because it demonstrates how Islam survived beyond its founders' personal influence, embedding itself into institutions and practices that could endure. Critics often argue that Islam's political dimension undermines its spiritual claims, but history suggests the opposite. It was precisely this integration of belief and governance that gave the community stability and purpose. Islam did not merely adapt to power, it redefined power itself, insisting that authority be justified through justice, mercy, and accountability to God. By the time the Prophet's life came to an end, Islam had already evolved into a self-sustaining civilization in the making, capable of expansion, adaptation, and continuity. This period reveals that the origins of Islam are hidden not in a single revelation or event, but in a sustained process of reform that addressed the deepest failures of the society from which it emerged. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, one of the greatest historical questions emerges, a question that still fuels debate among Muslims, non-Muslims, and historians alike. How did a community born in the deserts of Arabia expand with such speed and reach that within a single century it stretched from the borders of India to the shores of the Atlantic? Was this expansion driven purely by faith, or was it the result of calculated political and military strategy shaped by historical opportunity? The answer, as history often reveals, lies not in choosing one explanation over the other, but in understanding how belief and circumstance intertwined. The early Muslim community did not expand into a world of strength and stability it moved into. A world already weakened, fractured, and disillusioned with imperial rule. The Byzantine and Sasanian empires, exhausted by decades of war, had alienated their populations through heavy taxation, religious persecution, and centralized control, leaving many communities, particularly in Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, resentful rather than loyal. When Muslim forces entered these regions, they were not always seen as invaders, but often as an alternative to oppressive systems, offering comparatively lighter taxation, religious tolerance, and local autonomy in exchange for political allegiance. This pragmatic governance model challenges the simplistic narrative of forced conversion, as historical records show that conversion was neither immediate nor mandatory. In many regions, Islam remained a minority faith for generations. Faith, however, was the engine that sustained this expansion. The early Muslims believed they were participating in a moral mission rather than a campaign of conquest, guided by a worldview that framed struggle as accountability to God rather than personal glory. This belief produced discipline, unity, and resilience, qualities that fragmented imperial armies lacked. Leadership during this period was also crucial. The early caliphs governed with a combination of humility and authority, often living simply while administering vast territories, reinforcing the idea that power was a trust, not a privilege. Strategically, the Muslims adapted quickly, learning from the administrative systems of conquered lands rather than destroying them, incorporating Persian and Byzantine practices into a flexible governance structure that allowed continuity and stability. This adaptability stands in contrast to the rigid bureaucracies of the empires they replaced. Yet expansion was not without moral tension. Internal debates arose over wealth, leadership, and authority, revealing that Islam's growth tested its own ideals as much as it challenged external powers. These tensions culminated in civil conflicts that exposed the human vulnerability of a system still in formation. From a historical perspective, this period demonstrates that Islam's expansion cannot be reduced to a single cause. Faith provided meaning and motivation, strategy provided survival and success, historical context provided opportunity. To ignore any of these elements is to misunderstand the phenomenon entirely. What makes this expansion truly remarkable is not just its speed, but its endurance. Unlike many conquerors who ruled through fear alone, early Islamic governance created structures that populations adapted to rather than constantly resisted. Law, language, and culture gradually integrated, forming a shared civilization rather than a temporary empire. This is why Islam did not collapse when its early leaders died, and why its influence outlived dynasties, borders, and political systems. The question then is not whether Islam expanded through faith or strategy, but why this particular combination succeeded where others failed. History suggests that Islam offered something rare, a vision that addressed both the spiritual hunger and the social fatigue of a world in decline. And it was this synthesis of belief, governance, and adaptability that allowed a desert-born movement to reshape global history in ways that remain visible today. As Islam expanded beyond Arabia and became a global civilization, the story of its origins did not remain neutral. It was retold, reshaped, and often distorted through the lenses of power, fear, and ideology, giving rise to myths and misunderstandings that persist even today. Early Western and Byzantine sources, encountering Islam primarily as a rival political force rather than a spiritual movement, framed it as a threat to free, Christian dominance, portraying its rise in terms of invasion rather than transformation. These narratives were less concerned with understanding Islam on its own terms and more focused on explaining the sudden loss of territory, authority, and influence. Over time, this defensive posture hardened into intellectual tradition. Medieval European writers depicted Islam as a heresy or imitation, questioning the authenticity of its revelation while ignoring the social and ethical reforms it introduced. Such portrayals were not merely academic, they shaped popular imagination, reinforcing the idea that Islam's success could only be explained through violence, manipulation, or coincidence. During the colonial era, these narratives evolved rather than disappeared. European scholars, operating within imperial frameworks, often approached Islamic history with assumptions that mirrored their political interests, emphasizing despotism, stagnation, or irrationality while downplaying periods of innovation, pluralism, and intellectual exchange. At the same time, Muslim historiography developed its own challenges. In responding to external criticism, some narratives became overly defensive or idealized, reducing a complex history into moral perfection and discouraging critical inquiry. This mutual simplification, Islam as either menace or myth, obscured the nuanced reality of its origins. Modern academic study has attempted to correct these extremes, yet it too remains contested. Revisionist historians question traditional timelines and sources, while others defend the reliability of early Islamic accounts, creating debates that are often misunderstood by the public. What is frequently lost in these discussions is context. The fact that early Islamic sources emerged in an oral culture later committed to writing, with clear intentions of preservation, not deception, and that non-Islamic Sue. RCEs of the same period are equally shaped by bias, limitation, and political agendas. The persistence of these myths reveals less about Islam itself and more about how societies construct the other in moments of insecurity. Islam became a mirror onto which Europe projected its anxieties about unity, authority, and faith, especially as it faced its own religious fragmentation and moral crises. In the modern world, media and political discourse have inherited these historical biases, often reducing Islam to headlines and stereotypes disconnected from its origins. This is why the hidden origins of Islam remain controversial, not because they are unknowable, but because they are filtered through centuries of misunderstanding. A fair historical approach neither sanctifies nor demonizes. It asks why Islam emerged, how it functioned, and what conditions allowed it to endure. By stripping away myth, both critical and devotional, we are left with a more compelling story, one of human struggle, ethical vision, and historical consequence. Understanding these narratives is essential not to defend Islam or attack it, but to reclaim history from the shadows of ideology. Only then can the origins of Islam be examined as they truly are, complex, contextual, and profoundly influential. As Islam moved beyond Arabia and established itself as a global civilization, its story did not travel in a neutral form. Instead, it was reshaped by fear, rivalry, and power, giving birth to myths and misunderstandings that still dominate conversations today. Early Christian and Byzantine writers encountered Islam not as a faith seeking meaning, but as a force dismantling their political and religious dominance, and so they framed its rise as an external threat rather than an internal transformation of society. In these accounts, Islam was rarely studied for what it claimed to be. It was described in opposition, defined by what it challenged and replaced. Medieval Europe inherited these portrayals and amplified them, often depicting Islam as a distorted offshoot of Christianity or a deliberate fabrication, narratives that served psychological comfort at a time when Europe itself struggled with division, plague, and theological conflict. These interpretations were not accidental misunderstandings. They were responses to loss of land, authority, and certainty, and they helped construct an image of Islam that justified resistance without requiring understanding. During the colonial era, the lens shifted, but the bias remained. European scholars, writing under imperial rule, frequently presented Islamic history as static or authoritarian, contrasting it with a self-image of Western progress. While overlooking centuries of scientific, legal, and philosophical development within Muslim societies, this period also produced selective scholarship that separated Islam's spiritual message from its social reality, reducing it to doctrine while ignoring how it functioned as a lived system. Meanwhile, within the Muslim world, reactions to external critique often led to idealized histories that avoided complexity, turning Islam's past into untouchable perfection, rather than a dynamic human experience guided by principles. This dual distortion, external demonization and internal romanticization, created a gap where serious understanding struggled to survive. In the modern age, academic revisionism has reopened questions about early Islamic history, sometimes responsibly, sometimes provocatively challenging traditional narratives in ways that fuel confusion rather than clarity for general audiences. What is rarely acknowledged is that all early histories, Islamic, Christian, Jewish, or imperial, are products of their time, shaped by memory, power, and purpose. Singling out Islamic sources as uniquely unreliable reveals more about modern anxieties than historical reality. Media and political discourse today continue to recycle these inherited narratives, framing Islam through conflict while ignoring its ethical foundations and historical context. This is why the origins of Islam appear hidden or controversial, not because they are inaccessible, but because they are buried beneath centuries of storytelling driven by fear and ideology. To move beyond myth is not to defend Islam blindly or to dismiss criticism, but to approach its history with the same standards applied to any civilization, context, comparison, and humility. Only then can the origins of Islam be understood not as a mystery designed to divide, but as a historical phenomenon shaped by human conditions, moral urgency, and the enduring search for meaning. Centuries after its emergence in the deserts of Arabia, Islam continues to shape global politics, culture, ethics, and identity in ways few historical movements ever have, and this enduring influence is perhaps the final clue to understanding its hidden origins. Ideas that are born only of power or circumstance tend to fade when those conditions disappear. Yet Islam has survived the collapse of empires, the rise of nation-states, colonial domination, modern skepticism, and technological transformation, suggesting that its foundations run deeper than history alone. At its core, Islam did not merely answer theological questions. It addressed the human condition by offering a coherent framework that connected belief, morality, law, and community into a single vision of life. This integration is key to its longevity. Where many modern systems separate faith from public life, Islam insists that meaning, justice, and responsibility are inseparable, a principle that continues to resonate with millions navigating uncertainty and inequity. Today, historically, Islamic civilization demonstrated an unusual ability to adapt without losing its core identity, absorbing diverse cultures from Persian and Greek to African and South Asian, while maintaining a unifying ethical and spiritual center. This balance between universality and adaptability explains why Islam did not remain an Arab religion, but became a global one, spoken in hundreds of languages and practiced across continents. In the modern era, Islam's presence in global debates on governance, human rights, economics, and social justice is often framed as a problem rather than a perspective, yet this reaction itself reflects Islam's continued relevance. A system that no longer matters is not feared, debated, or resisted. For many Muslims, Islam provides not nostalgia for a lost past, but a living moral compass that challenges consumerism, individualism, and moral relativism, offering instead a sense of purpose rooted in accountability and community. For non-Muslims, Islam often represents an unresolved question. How did a faith born outside Western modernity produce a civilization that rivaled and influenced it so profoundly? The answer lies in Islam's origins as both a spiritual awakening and a social reform, a movement that spoke to universal human concerns, justice, dignity, meaning, while grounding them in daily practice. The Quran's emphasis on reflection, knowledge, and ethical action fostered a culture that valued learning and debate, contributing to scientific and philosophical developments that still underpin modern thought. Even today, concepts such as charity as obligation, law as moral responsibility, and leadership as trust challenge dominant global norms and invite reconsideration of how societies define success and progress. The persistence of Islam also reveals a deeper truth about history, that the most powerful forces are not those imposed by coercion, but those that align belief with lived reality. Islam's ability to survive criticism, reform itself internally, and inspire commitment across generations suggests that its origins tapped into something fundamental within human experience. This does not mean Islam has been immune to misuse or failure like all human systems. It has been shaped by those who wielded it, sometimes contradicting its own ideals. Yet its capacity for self-critique and renewal remains one of its defining strengths. In a world increasingly fragmented by ideology, identity, and uncertainty, the questions Islam first raised about purpose, justice, and responsibility remain unresolved, which is why its story is not confined to the past. The hidden origins of Islam are ultimately revealed not only through archaeology or text, but through its survival itself. A movement that began in obscurity, challenged empires, and outlived centuries of opposition continues to influence how millions understand life, death, and meaning. This endurance does not close the mystery, it deepens it. Islam's origins matter today because they remind us that history is not driven solely by power or chance, but by ideas capable of reshaping how humans see themselves and the world. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that the most transformative forces often begin quietly, rooted in moral urgency, waiting for a world ready to be changed.